But my talk is going to be a little different from what we've had so far because we are no longer going to hang out in BC. We're going to actually go back to where I grew up in Arizona. And you may say, Hannah, that's a desert. There aren't trees there, but you'd be wrong. There are some. Maybe not old growth, but nevertheless. So Kelly was kind enough to mention that I did my master's degree at the University of Arizona. And one of the things that the University of Arizona is most famous for is for being the birthplace of tree ring research. And so that's actually what I did for my master's, was spend an awful lot of times not looking at the outside of trees, but the insides and what that can tell us. So that's kind of what I'm going to move forward with today and tell you about something that I'd worked with and had a paper published on recently. So we have this beautiful image here. If you look at it, we all see something maybe a little different. We'll notice things like stripes and dots. Some of us, myself included, might even see this as art, something worthy of hanging up in your house. Depending on how your eyes work with things like stripes, maybe you even find it a little dizzying and perhaps not worth looking at because, it's different shades of brown. But people like me, dendrochronologists, coming from the word dendro, tree, and chronology, time, see something a little different. So as I mentioned, the invention of tree ring science started with this man, Alexander Elcott Douglas, at the University of Arizona just over 100 years ago. And this guy was extremely passionate about patterns. The whole goal of his research was to try and see if he could find something about sunspots recorded in the trees on Earth, transferred by photosynthesis. We since learned that he was dead wrong, and sunspots don't really show up in tree rings at all, but his ability to recognize patterns brought us to realize that tree rings can tell us an awful lot. So we all have an idea that tree rings are these round circular things that we can recognize easily in a picture on certain cuts of wood, if you have a very nice table, for example. But if we get a little closer, well, what are they really? So, does this have a laser on it?
Yes,
This one?
It doesn't show up too well.
Doesn't show up? Okay, I have a hand, that's fine. So this right here is a very, very close-up image of a tree ring section, I guess we'll say. So if we're going to imagine what the rest of the tree, the round cut, might look like, we'll see the bark is somewhere over here, and the center of the tree, called the pith, is going to be in this corner, so to kind of give you a good idea of what's happening. Everything in the blue sort of box right there is one tree ring. So you see lots and lots and lots of little tiny cells that all compose this ring. Tree rings actually have two parts. This very, very big part right here in the lighter tissue that represents the growth that happens during the summer and the springtime when trees are happy, buds are coming out, like times around now. And then the darker sort of area when the tree slows down its growth in the fall and the winter. So together they make one tree ring. The tree builds outwards from the center as it goes. And we have, as it were, a record of what happened each year in the tree's life cycle as it goes on and out. So more than just stripes, it's got a lot more going on. And some of us who are really interested in looking at really, really small things get to see sort of the insides. So what do we do with them? We have an idea, and I think most people are kind of familiar with the idea that, trees get a new ring every year. And that's correct for the most part. Unfortunately, our lives aren't quite that easy, which is why we have to, get multiple degrees to learn how to do this and deal with tree rings. But essentially, we get very, very old school. So what's shown here on this image is something called a skeleton plot that was invented at the University of Arizona. So a tree ring researcher will prepare a piece of wood like this with really, really fine-grained sandpaper, like I'm talking microscopic scale sandpaper, so that we can see each of those cells from the picture that I described before. We then go through and we assess under a microscope each of these rings individually and as a whole. And we'll make these kind of funny-looking graphs that are really counterintuitive because these marks up here represent very small rings, even though they're very tall. And the tallest rings, actually, the tallest lines represent the smallest rings. So it's a graphical system that we can use to say, all right, if this is the middle of the tree, it's 0. 0 is just the border, but about here at 9, it's a rather small ring compared to the ones around it, and so on and so on. And so with our pen and our graph paper, we make long strips of paper with lots of tape. And I've seen them that are 5-6 feet long. So we do this for multiple trees in the same place, and we'll notice that patterns match. We can actually pick out specific patterns that occur throughout multiple trees in one area, and the one area is important. Rings that are all very small in this year, or a pattern of 2 big rings but with 1 small in the middle, or 2 small, or 3 small altogether. We can pick that out over time and begin to create a sequence of how these trees relate to each other. So these trees have these matching patterns because tree rings, the size of them, whether they're big or small, or whether there are things called frost rings, that happens when it frosts early, are resultant of the climate in that one particular area. So let's say we had a very dry March. So if we went and we looked at the tree ring record, 10, 15 years from now, we would see that, maybe the tree ring for 2019 is a little smaller just because we've had less rainfall so far. You can see this in any number of ways, and the crazy thing is that even though each of these sections looked different, they all have the same patterns because they're all from the same place. So we can even put numbers on these. I can even determine, and so can anyone else who knows how to do this, that this particular ring on these trees is the year 1800, and that might be 1700. So it's this really exciting and complicated and multifaceted way to look at trees, and just with pen and paper and microscopes. But we get technical and digital now too. So we can even look at multiple trees across multiple sites in multiple different places that might be very far apart. For example, trees in California and Arizona. And see that even though these peaks may go up and down, the computer can tell us that actually these patterns all have the same basic up and down points. Like for example right here, they all go down, even though they go down in different ways. And it's spectacular. And even though I am an archaeologist by training, and I know that things like carbon dating exists and any other number of ways to tell how old something is, or even to understand the forests, ways to understand what's been happening in a particular area or what the weather's been like, tree rings, in my opinion, are undoubtedly the best. Because, yes?
Can I ask about, when you've got one of those things, you've sacrificed the tree, right, to get it
No,
size.
you'll see in a little bit.
Okay.
No, not necessarily. But in any case, tree rings are the best tool that we can possibly use to understand forests, people, landscapes in general. First, because they record events with annual resolution. That means that if I want to know exactly what happened in the year 1240 AD, a tree ring, or lots of them, more like, can tell me. It's not, it was between this 100-year period. You can tell one particular year in the tree ring record. In fact, sometimes you can even get smaller and go in smaller increments in the fall or in the spring. Nothing else has that kind of resolution yet. It's possible that in the future we'll get some insane technology that can do this too, but as of right now, tree rings are the only way. Furthermore, trees record all aspects about their environment, including things like how much water is available. And while here that's not so much an issue, in places like Arizona, the trees are very dependent upon how much water falls. And that's something that is extremely clear to see in the tree ring record. You can compare tree ring size to rainfall records from the same year, and it correlates. You can see things like temperature in places in the Arctic where it's very cold, and the trees can't grow if it's not warm enough. You can even see things like natural disasters. Volcanic eruptions have particular chemical signals and can often injure trees, as well as forest fires. And the tree ring record shows that too. Individual trees can say if they were burned or if a flood happened even. And further, atmospheric gases can make themselves known in the tree ring record as well. Things like pollution, like the record of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. They're incredible. But I think the reason that trees are perhaps the absolute best records of climate and people are that they don't lie. I had a professor I worked with at Arizona who always told me that trees have no political agenda. They don't care what's happening around them. They just are. They exist. They grow. They're doing what nature has taught them to do. And with that, they can teach us so much on the inside. But what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time so much is that a really lovely part about tree rings and their reliability, their pattern matching, the degree to which they can tell us dates, is that they can take us back in time. So if you start here with a tree that is growing today, and to go back on your question, when we sample trees, we don't have to cut them down. We can take about pencil-sized, little small sections of cores that actually we've proven over the past 100 years with scientific study that they don't harm trees. So we can non-destructively take samples from trees that are living today, from trees that might be dead, these dead tops in old growth forests. Take samples from them, as well as even historic and archaeological structures. And we can find the same patterns over and over again to create chronologies that start today and go back, in some cases, in different parts of the world, almost 8,000 to 10,000 years. So there's a lot of possibility and a lot of things that can be talked about and looked into in the past and the present. One case in which I used tree rings to learn more about the past was at this beautiful mission that was built by Spanish colonizers near my hometown in Tucson, Arizona. So this was actually taken on a rare cloudy day out in the desert. But this is the mission. This is what it looks like. And at first glance, you probably are wondering, well, where's the wood that she's going to talk about? Because it seems rather absent. Well, it's got plaster on the outside. The inside has wood. So I promise you this is all relevant. But to give a better map of what's happening at this time between, I'd say 1700 and 1850, is that Spain has taken and colonized most of the southwestern, what we know as the United States today, as well as Mexico and down into South America. And we're all the way up in disputed territory right now. But right about where that red dot is where the greater Tucson area is, and that's where this mission finds its home. And I think this picture was taken in about 1890. So slightly older, placed in Vancouver. What do we know about it today in terms of its chronology? If it was a tree ring, what would its tree rings, or if it was a tree, what would its rings tell us? A prominent Jesuit missionary called Father Kino first established, he was a Franciscan from Spain. He established lots of churches in this area, but at this particular area in Tucson, he built some foundations around 1700 that were unused. The local Native American peoples, the O'odham groups, they had a prominent uprising because they'd had enough of the Spanish oppressing them and trying to force them to convert to a different religion around 1751. And so records of many of the churches around this time are destroyed, as well as the churches themselves, and there's suggestion that this in fact damaged the building that was there at the time, perhaps preventing it from being reworked or found. But in any case, an attempt to build what we would think of as a proper church with wood and building something that we would recognize today as a church would happen about 1756 when a different Franciscan friar began to construct it. At this point, the Spanish Franciscans have completely taken over this mission. They've built a village around for themselves, people who work at the mission, as well to try to convert the local indigenous community. So by 1768, there are records that are consistent, again, historical written records that talk about what's happening at the mission. Around 1783 is when we believe the construction happened on the church that I showed you a picture of, the church that still stands today, and it was probably finished by 1797. In 1820, they built a whole bunch onto it. That's called the convento. This is a Spanish word that probably means convent. We don't know if it was actually a convent or not, but that part of the church was finished by 1820. And at the 1821, the Franciscans leave, and Roman Catholics that are not Franciscan come in and again inhabit this church and handle it, and it still functions as a church today, pardon me, for the local Oldham community. And so I was very fortunate to be able to share my knowledge and skills with them. There we are. So here's a map of what I was kind of telling you. So if we imagine those two towers that I showed you at the beginning, they're about right here and right here. And that's the rest of the church area. There was an archaeological excavation by some members at the University of Arizona in the 60s, and they produced this map for us, giving us an idea of when different things were built. So over here in this blue square is where this first church building was supposed to have been built. They have archaeological record of what happened there, and they have some items that leads them to believe that's where it was. Now, based on its assumed construction as well as the dimensions of the area, there was a belief that the wood, these big wood timbers called vigas, to hold up the roof supports, were actually moved from that building and added to this area of the convento when it was built around 1820. And so here's the holes where the vigas would have been. They had been taken out for renovation, but since a new roof has been built over, so they don't actually function as roof timbers anymore, but rather just remnants of what old construction might have looked like. And I had worked here for a different project archaeologically before, and so I was speaking with the head archaeologist who works with the San Javier District Council, and he had mentioned this to me, that they were probably reused wood, and I said, well, I do tree rings now. Do you want to find out for sure? And I was really fortunate that this is something they were interested in, because this is an absolutely beautiful place that combines Spanish colonial heritage with that of the indigenous population. And if you're ever in Tucson, this is a beautiful place to visit, not only for the outside of the mission, but the inside as well. The art is spectacular, and it is a really very, very Tucson thing. I think it's some of the best in the city. But as I mentioned, these vigas, these long wooden timbers, had been taken out for restoration of the roof inside. So they were sitting in the backyard, which was perfect for us because it would have been kind of difficult to get up to the roof to get them. So I, with some people at the lab as well, had the chance to go and have a look and see if we could take small pencil-shaped samples from these pieces. What I noticed when I got there was that the ends of these vigas had branches. So what this means to me is that each of these was once an individual tree, which is exciting all in itself because you needed several of these big, big trees. I think you needed about 15 or 20, and they don't grow in Tucson. You have to go to the mountains in the north or the south or the east to find them. Other things that I saw were these notches that had been carved into the trees to hold it up. And also textured markings both here and on that end. Well, you can't see them as much here, but especially on this end of one of the vigas. It showed that had been drug a very long distance on the ground, probably by horses. And this one showed this very angular cut, so we can get an idea of how exactly they were hatching away at these trees to cut them down from the mountains nearby. Not nearby, maybe farther away. But what I was really curious as to what the tree rings were trying to tell us. So tree ring people have the express pleasure of using power tools often for science. So we got to do that, and that's always a good time. So you can see here that one of these vigas is being sampled by what's called an increment borer. This is a one you can use for archaeological purposes, but he's actually pulled it out now, so he's not actually using the power drill attached to it to get into the wood, which is, again, power drills for science. It's good. It's good. So we had samples from 4 of these vigas that we could get to. It was kind of difficult because they were meant to go back up into the roof. And so we were encouraged to not take samples from places that would be visible from the ground, which is very reasonable. If someone's letting you take pieces of their wood away, you probably should at least respect their wishes. They had also found in the walls of this structure that was connected to another that there was a wood timber, that it was just there, and they weren't going to put it back. So they were kind enough to give us, with a lovely orange saw, a slice from the middle. And after I prepared them and had a look, this is what they looked like. Very nice and shiny. They were of a species of pine that grows in southwest BC called ponderosa, which is lovely. It's a nice yellow pine. It's good. And so I began to work with them. And we can revisit skeleton plotting again, because these are actually from this site. These are the different timbers that I used to sort of give some dates from when these timbers had been cut down, so that I could answer the question, well, were they reused or not? Reuse is an interesting question. It speaks to how people interact with their landscape. Are these things, throwaways? Are they meant to be used again? Are they so rare that to get rid of them would be a problem? So determining whether or not something had been reused can tell a lot about not only in the environment, but the people's attitude towards it. And what I found out, unfortunately, negated what had been known before. And no, they weren't reused timbers. I got some end dates of cutting of 1784, 92, 96, and 1811, which are long after the first church had been completely dissolved. So, no, unfortunately not. But a date that was interesting to me was this one, the 1784, shortly after the construction had began on the church. And that came from the big cross section. If I can go back. There we are. Came from that big cross section that had been inside the wall. So what was really interesting is that was from when they started building the church. These ones have been added later in reconstruction. But what's not obvious from the tree rings in my beautiful graphs alone is that these come from different places. Using tree rings, you can actually map wood to a place based on its ring structure, because it deals with the local environment each. So this piece of wood came from the mountains far north of the mission, whereas these ones came from much closer. So again, this can tell us more about resources that were available at the time, how people navigated this desert landscape to get these large pieces of timber. There's a lot more left to learn from this mission, and they're doing renovations constantly, which is quite happy for people who like to do tree ring science. So we've fostered a communication between not only the local San Javier Totem Council and the mission itself and the local archaeologists to try to hope to use the tree ring lab in Tucson and people there, and people like me who are interested in both history and the natural world, to learn more about this church and about the desert landscape that it was built on, and how the people who lived there and around it, near it, navigated their desert landscape. So that's all for me. Thank you.
Thank you.